This leads us to the second main concept that we want to try to grasp from Leopold's text, which is the idea of a land ethic. This is probably Leopold's greatest contribution. The kind of metaphor or the terminology of thinking like a mountain or thinking like a forest is something that Leopold contributed as well. But the idea of a land ethic is one of the first systematic statements of an environmentally based ethic, you could say, okay, or what we'll soon call a non-anthropocentric ethic, in the sense that it's not focused on human beings and their concerns, but trying to focus rather on something like nature itself, or environments themselves, or ecosystems themselves. And Leopold's key term here is land. So he continuously focuses on land, which includes soil as well as the organisms that grow in the soil and the complex ecological relationships between organisms that live in some area of land. So we want to ask, what does Leopold mean by this land ethic? What is this land ethic that Leopold proposes and defends, and that he bequeathed to subsequent generations of environmental ethicists? To get a handle on that question, I'd like to start where Leopold starts with it, which is with something he calls the ethical sequence. What Leopold has in mind here is that there's a historical trajectory he's proposing. There's a kind of historical sequence to ethical systems, that our ethical systems are tending in a certain direction, and the land ethic will be the next step he proposes in this direction that our ethical systems are tending. So he starts off his famous passage about our chapter about the land ethic with a story about Odysseus returning from his journeys in Homer's famous Greek epic, the Odyssey. The main character, Odysseus, has been traveling, and he sort of has to take a long route to get back home. And when he gets back home, he finds that some of the slave girls in his household, so these are humans, but they're considered slaves or property of Odysseus, that they've been up to some kind of, like, they've been stealing things. I don't remember exactly what it is, but they've been doing something that's unacceptable to Odysseus, or shows some kind of disobedience or wrongness of some kind. And Odysseus's reply, or his response to this, is to hang them all from a rope. So he kills all the slave girls that he suspects or has found to have behaved badly in this way. And so Leopold says, today we consider that wrong. We wouldn't, even if, a human being is stolen from you, it's not just from their having stolen, it's not generally okay to kill them, or to, like, if people were working for you and they stole for you, you wouldn't be justified in, like, hanging them from a rope until they died. So it seems like this is wrong, and to us today. But at the time, these slave girls were just property. They were just considered, even though they were human, they were considered something that Odysseus owned, and he could do whatever he wanted with. And so Leopold says we've gotten better since then. Our ethical systems have improved so that we no longer find it acceptable to treat human beings as property. He says, during the 3,000 years which have since elapsed, ethical criteria have been extended to many fields of conduct, with corresponding shrinkages in those judged by expediency only. So it's become less and less. Expediency here means something like effectiveness, or just getting the job done, or doing whatever it is you want to do. And so the point here is that our ethical systems have introduced more constraints on behavior that's judged by expediency only. So we recognize more restrictions on what would be an acceptable way of getting whatever it is that we want, or whatever we think would be most effective. And then Leopold goes on to explain how the land ethic is the next step in this sequence. So he says, the extension of ethics, so far studied only by philosophers, is actually a process in ecological evolution. So interestingly, he's trying to redescribe something that has normally been studied just from a philosophical perspective. He's trying to redescribe it in ecological terms, so we can understand it as something that has to do with certain organisms, human organisms in particular, in interaction with each other and with their environments. So we're now reading ethical systems as something that themselves are ecological and are part of an ecology. He says its sequences, that is the sequences of ethical systems or of ethics itself, may be described in ecological as well as in philosophical terms. An ethic, ecologically, is a limitation on freedom of action in the struggle for existence. And you may know that phrase "struggle for existence" is a implicit reference to Darwin, because in Darwin's Origin of Species, Darwin had repeatedly used the term "struggle for existence" to describe what Darwin believed was the normal condition of life for organisms in nature, so that for all of evolutionary history, organisms have been struggling for their existence. In any given situation where you have animals or plants, you have living things on Earth, those things are struggling for their existence. Almost always, they're struggling for their existence in the sense that more of those organisms die off than survive. Okay, there are limited resources, and so not all of the organisms of a certain type, a certain species, or a certain generation are going to survive and reproduce to make organisms in the next generation. And that's what Darwin called the struggle for existence. So from a Darwinian perspective, which tends to be kind of like the modern biological perspective, the struggle for existence is ubiquitous. It's something that characterizes life throughout nature. And what Leopold is saying here is that we can think of ethics as a kind of limitation of freedom of action within the context of this general struggle for existence. So if an organism, say, if there's reason to think that an organism could benefit in the struggle for existence by behaving a certain way, then it has freedom of action to behave in that way. And it has freedom of action to behave in that way. An ethic would be a limitation on that action. Even though that action may benefit the organism may still withhold from taking that action for ethical reasons. So this is how Leopold is describing ethics. He's saying it's a kind of limitation that an organism accepts or that is imposed on an organism in the context of its struggle for existence. And then he describes an ethic philosophically, and he says it's a differentiation of social from antisocial conduct. So notice that the philosophical definition doesn't really refer to environments or to ecology. It rather just focuses on human-to-human relations, social versus antisocial. Okay, but Leopold goes on to say that these are two definitions of one thing. So in ethic, it's the same thing, whether we conceive it in terms of a limitation on our interactions with others, or we conceive it as something that changes our interaction with environments in the context of our struggle for existence. And Leopold then goes on to discuss or to propose an account of the origins of ethics. So he says, the thing has its origin in the tendencies, this one thing that ethics is, whether it's considered ecologically or philosophically, has its origin in the tendency of interdependent individuals and groups to evolve modes of cooperation. The ecologist calls these symbioses. Politics and economics are advanced symbioses in which the original free-for-all competition has been replaced in part by cooperative mechanisms with an ethical content. So what Leopold is proposing here is that we can understand the human phenomenon of ethics, as well as political systems and economic systems, as kinds of complex, advanced, as he calls them, symbioses, where we have limitations on the freedom of action of human individuals in order to advance cooperation or brought about through cooperation. So there's a limitation on the individual struggle for existence. There's a distinction between social and antisocial conduct. And this leads to human communities being more cooperative overall, and to the extent that they're cooperative, more effective, presumably, as communities. And at this point, Leopold can describe this next phase that he's proposing in the ethical sequence, which is the land ethic. So he's going to talk about, the sort of last phase of the sequence and this new phase that he's proposing, and sort of say how the new phase is a natural extension of the previous phase. He writes, all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of independent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in that community, but his ethics prompt him also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. So again, we have this kind of description of a struggle for existence that kind of would lead individuals to behave in self-interested ways, but also mechanisms of cooperation and ethics as a mechanism to enhance cooperation or to support or promote cooperation. He goes on to say, the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community, which is what human beings were before he's proposing. What we've considered ourselves as for much of human history is conquerors of the land community, dictators of the land community. We get to say what happens. Whatever we want to have happen with the land, that's what we make happen. Okay, if we can bring it about, we bring it about. We don't feel any ethical restrictions on it. We just manipulate the land for the sake of our own struggle for existence. But now he's saying the land ethic will change this role from conqueror to member and citizen of the land community. So now Homo sapiens, human beings, will be members and citizens of the land community. It implies respect for his fellow members, that is, other parts of the land community, that includes soil, water, plants, and animals, the land, collectively. And also respect for the community as such, which again is like the land, okay, the total community. The conqueror, this is a basic statement then of the land ethic. And a little bit further on, Leopold summarizes this as, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And this phrase will be repeatedly quoted by subsequent philosophers in environmental ethics and others writing about environmentalism. It ends up being a very inspiring idea for a lot of people. And it again gives us a kind of encapsulated statement of the land ethic itself. A thing is right. So we're getting a criterion of right and wrong here, kind of like what we had from utilitarianism or from Kantianism. This is Leopold's criterion. He says a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's worth noting here as well, statement that Leopold just makes in passing, that the conqueror role is eventually self-defeating. He describes this as something that we've learned by now, humanity has learned by now. If you try to be a conqueror, you will fail. And he gives a reason for that, interestingly, which is that conquerors always think they know what's best for everybody, but they never do. And so just as that's been the case with human communities, where if you try to impose your will or your view on a community of people rather than try to learn from that community what the community wants, then what you do will be self-defeating. Then if you try to do that, you're a conqueror and what you do won't work. Likewise, with the biotic community Leopold is proposing. So far, we've tried to just command nature, just control nature, just make nature do whatever would work best for us. But taking that conqueror role, he's arguing, is going to eventually be, if it isn't already, self-defeating. It's going to end up, we're not going to be successful because we're not being humble enough, is the idea. We're not being humble enough in our relation to the community, that in this case, the biotic community, we're not learning from the biotic community what the biotic community needs in order to be sustained, in order to continue to operate, in order to flourish. And so we inevitably will do a bad job of being leaders if we try to be conquerors. We do a better job if we try to learn from the biotic community what the community and all of its members want and need.